Let's do the 60-second savings challenge. Step 1, download Rocket Money. Step 2, link your accounts and see every subscription you're paying for. Tap one you don't use and cancel it. That's money back every month. Step 3, create a financial goal. $50 every paycheck, or let the app automatically move small amounts of cash when you can afford it. In a week, you'll forget you set it up. In a month, you'll see real dollars piling up. In a year, you'll be shocked at how much money you've saved. Bonus challenge, upload an internet or phone bill and let Rocket Money try to lower it. You only pay if they find you savings. On average, Rocket Money members can save up to $740 a year when using all the app's premium features. Users love the app with over 186,000 five-star ratings. Make saving money the resolution you actually keep. Start the 60-second savings challenge at rocketmoney.com/cancel. That's rocketmoney.com/cancel. rocketmoney.com/cancel.
Welcome to Quiet Riot, the politics podcast that is more 10-point plan than 200-point font. I'm Kenny Campbell.
And I'm Naomi Smith. We are here to bring the data, the debate and the dignitaries to show that all is not quite as dreadful as the media would have us believe.
Our aim is to educate, not placate, to chill, not thrill, and to explain, not complain.
So pop that puffer jacket back in the cupboard until next winter, crack open the window and let the sunshine help you begin another Quiet Riot. Quiet Riot. Hello and welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Naomi.
And I'm Kenny.
This week we've made the decision not to cover the running commentary on Andy, Mandy and Epstein, though doubtless we're going to have to return to that at a later point. And we also decided to be kind and leave the Trump State of Union address for Alex, who's going to be back at the weekend because he is gagging to talk to you all about it.
Instead, we're going to be taking a deep look into the polls, gaming the results of the by-election taking place this week, and previewing the forthcoming national and local elections in May.
So to help us with all of that and more, making their return to the show, it is the granddaddy of polling, Peter Kellner. Welcome back, Peter.
Well, at least you didn't say great granddaddy of polling.
Now, Peter, as chairman and president formerly of YouGov, you must have known one of the founders pretty well. Did Nadeem Zahawi's defection to reform surprise you?
Oh, yes, it did. I had no inkling that it was coming. I hadn't seen Nadeem since well before the general election, more than 18 months ago. I'd assumed that he'd decided to leave politics to spend more time with his money. My sense from 3 or 4 years ago, he was quite disillusioned with the political life. But I imagine that in the end, he just couldn't keep away and decided
but
this
in
was
terms of knowing his politics, did it surprise you that it was reform he went to? Or is it not really about his ideology? It's about power, and he could just see where power might more likely lie than with the party he had been a minister for?
I thought of Nadeem as a slightly right of Tory centre politician. I mean, he was a pro-Brexit, one of the things we would disagree about. But I didn't think he was beyond the broad scale of the day's Conservative Party. Mm-hmm. There was nothing which made me feel he was a reform type. But remember, you see, in YouGov, you had Nadeem, who was Conservative, Stephen Shakespeare, who had fought as a Conservative, I with my sort of Labour-supporting background. So when we discussed politics, over a drink, we weren't trying to argue with each other. It's pointless. Yeah. So we would discuss the personalities and issues and what was going on, what might happen in this election or that contest. I remember during the Iraq War, Nadeem was incredibly optimistic. He thought Saddam would be removed quickly. Well, that was true. And he thought then it would be milk and honey for Iraq for the rest of the time. Well, he got that wrong, but I'm not sure any of us can take much pride in what we said at the time.
Quiet Riot. It is election week. Technically, every week is election week if you're the kind of person who refreshes council by-election results with a cup of coffee on a Friday morning. Parish councils, town councils, district councils, heck, even the parent-teacher committee tends to have a by-election each week. But it is not every week. we get a proper Westminster by-election like the one in Gorton and Denton. A quick recap. The contest was triggered by the resignation of former Labour MP Andrew Gwynn. He previously held the seat with a chunky 13,000 majority. On paper, that sounds comfortable. In practice, it's now being talked about as a genuine three-way scrap between Labour, Reform and the Greens, which is either healthy pluralism or a psophologist's fever dream. Andy Burnham was blocked from running by Labour's National Executive Committee, who chose Angeliki Stogia. The Greens have put up local plumber Hannah Spencer, and Reform have plumped for Matt Goodwin. We have a full list of the runners and riders in the show notes. John Sweeney, who appropriately is a war correspondent by trade, went to Gorton and Denton, spoke to a few people. Let's have a listen.
Who are you going to vote for?
Reform.
And why is that?
Because I've had enough of Labour. Well, I'm voting to keep that fascist Farage out. That's for one. We don't want another Trump. One's bad enough.
Who are you going to vote for?
Well, it's probably, no, that they're very unpopular, but probably Labour.
Labour have let down disabled communities when they threaten to take away personal independence payments from people who need it to be able to get by. People just have seen them sort of abandon a lot of their pledges to working people and working class communities.
I've never voted, I don't understand now.
Don't you believe in democracy?
I don't believe in anything, only what I can see.
Will you be voting?
Yeah, Reform. The MP that's gone off on ill health, he's wanted to stop my heating allowance, and I'd nursed my husband with Alzheimer's and dementia for 8 years. No, I'd had enough of all of them. Voted Labour all my life. I'm 84. I've had enough. I'm glad I'm on my way out and not my way in. I don't like the world anymore, so I'm sorry.
No one seriously thinks that the result alone topples Keir Starmer. The real stress test comes with the mega elections in May that we're going to be talking about in the second half of the show. But by-elections are political mood music. So what do pros like Peter Kellner actually look for? Beneath the vox pops, the viral clips, and those mysteriously enthusiastic bar charts on leaflets, what are the real signals hiding the noise? Peter, Gorton and Denton, let's start with the name, because I think it tells us something. 2 towns, 2 different local authorities, cobbled together as part of the last round of boundary review. And we've got a lot of them now. The something and something seat, in this case, the Gorton and Denton. How typical would you say it is in terms of having distinct parts with rather different demographics as one of the 650 seats we have in the UK?
It's much more common than it used to be for a very particular reason. One of the things that happened with the last boundary review, the rules were changed to make sure that the number of electors in each seat was much closer to the average. Before there'd been a latitude, I think you could be 10% out either way. It is now 5%. And one of the things that happened when there was a more relaxed, there's a 10% rule, is that there was, and I think it was a stated part of the rule book, that the Commission should try and keep coherent boundaries around each constituency. Well, the more you force it towards a much narrower interpretation and use of the average, the harder it is to stick to normal political or social groupings. You've got 2/3 of it, which is essentially Gorton, where you've got both a large Muslim population and a lot of graduates and professionals, students. And then you've got roughly 1/3, which is Denton, which is much more white, working class.
And a bit older?
A bit older, yeah. For the parties, for the campaigns, it's if you like, a bit of a problem because you can't find one kind of message to speak to one kind of voter. You've got, in a sense, 2 partial constituencies, which are really very different, brought together.
There's a lot going on in this by-election, isn't there? I mean, it's fascinating on so many levels. Are there any comparable midterm by-elections from history that you think this is even close to?
There have been a lot of by-elections in history which have the same sort of historical resonance, that they matter for particular reasons. And I remember one, a by-election in Dudley, mid-90s. It was a pretty safe Conservative seat, and Labour smashed it, and that sent sort of shockwaves through. And you get, I can go back, boring for history, but there's something very particular about this by-election. It may set a pattern for future by-elections, in which case it'll be remembered as the first. And it's this. You can look at it, if you want, as a sort of right v left. If you like, the conventional way, shall we call it the traffic lights versus the blues? Traffic lights, red Labour, amber Lib Dem, green, and then the two versions of blue, Conservative and Reform. And then it looks like 2-1 but for the traffic lights. And you would normally expect, therefore, there to be a traffic light winner.
Yeah.
But because of first past the post, you can't rely on that. But the thing which is even more startling, and in 10 years' time, will either be seen as a flash in the pan or a sign of the future, it looks like around 60% of the vote will go to either the Greens or Reform, to the two insurgent parties. And the traditional mainstream parties are going to do badly. I mean, even if Labour narrowly wins, their vote will be massively down on what it was 18 months ago.
Yeah.
And the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats are nowhere. So if you see this in some sense as a mainstream versus insurgent type of contest, it's the first at a parliamentary level that we've seen where this is the case.
So it's either going to be patient zero for what we have to come, and it'll kind of infect our by-elections going forward, or it's a kind of one-off contained illness. Fascinating that 2/3 of those that are going to vote will almost certainly vote for an insurgent party, neither of whom, of course, had a footprint. They didn't have local infrastructure. They may have had a few councillors, but they didn't have the machinery on the doorsteps that a traditional Conservative, Labour or Lib Dem party would have had in one of their held seats. How much is that likely to be a factor, do you think? Or are the Greens and Reform now so awash with cash they've kind of been able to buy their way out of that?
I think it's a minor factor in this by-election, because fighting a by-election is very different from fighting each of 650 seats in a general election, where the lack of the infrastructure of the Greens and Reform will matter. And money can't solve everything. Back in 1997, Jimmy Goldsmith funded the referendum party, and he spent up to the £20 million limit. He spent as much as Labour, Conservative, in that election. Got nowhere. So national money isn't the be-all and end-all. But having the infrastructure seat by seat, at least the ones that matter to you, in the case of Labour and the Conservatives, will be, 300, 400 or so. In the case of the Lib Dems, maybe 100. But for the Greens and Reform, it's not at all clear if they're going to make a breakthrough exactly where it'll be.
Yeah.
And one can do local polling, one can do MRP polling and infer from that. But really, it's more of a shot in the dark. In a by-election, you can put all the people and money, well, there are financial rules, but in practical purposes, you can flood it with resources, including human resources. And
there are reports of 1,000 Labour activists and 1,000 Green activists all being shipped in for the final 48 hours. So you're right. By-elections do not necessarily translate into predictors of things to come for all of those reasons and more. But there are also going to be things that this by-election will trigger, and that will depend on what the outcome is. We're going to go through each of those in turn. But Kenny, I think you had a little nugget from PMQs today.
Well, I mean, Starmer himself acknowledged how important this by-election is, not just for him, but for the country. And he even dropped it into this week's PMQs. Let's have a quick listen.
I also have to raise this. A death threat was shared by Reform's Deputy Council Leader in Lancashire against the brilliant member for Bolsover. It said she should be shot. When death threats were made against the member for Clacton, I stood at this dispatch box and condemned them outright. If he has any decency or backbone, he will stand up, apologise, condemn the comments and sack the individual in his parties. Will he do so?
Nigel Farage.
so he has neither the decency nor the backbone to condemn a death threat to a member of this House, whichever party they are in. He doesn't have the decency or the backbone to condemn it and to sack the individual. And that just shows that his party have got nothing to offer the country but grievance and division. Look at their candidate in Gorton and Denton, a man who says anyone who isn't white cannot be English. No wonder he's been endorsed by Tommy Robinson. It doesn't represent our country. And anybody who wants to stand against that hatred and division should vote Labour on Thursday tomorrow in Gorton and Denton.
So there are no lessons to learn from a by-election as much as they are very, very different from a general election. So, Peter, I'd love to go through with you the kind of the main, most likely outcomes. You hinted at it, one of them a minute ago. Labour win, but on a vastly reduced majority. Does that vindicate him not selecting Burnham? Does it mean he definitely, is looking much safer than he would have done otherwise? What do you think that means for the government and the Labour Party?
Naomi, if I may, if Reform gets less than 30%, and the two opinion polls, very small samples, not at all reliable, huge margin for error, but they both have Reform on around 28, 29%. If Reform are below 30%, they almost certainly won't win the seat. If Reform gets north of around 36, 37%, they will win more or less regardless of the amount of tactical voting, because it's just too big to overcome. But if they get between 30 and, say, 36%, if there's tactical voting, either for Labour or for the Greens, on a significant scale, Reform loses. If there's no tactical voting and the Labour-Green vote is split down the middle, then Reform wins. And it obviously matters who wins, but the numbers behind the victory are going to matter almost as much.
Indeed. All right, so the win is Labour's, but it's on a vastly reduced majority. Might only be a few votes in it. We may have had a full recount.
Yeah.
What does that mean, do you think, for the Prime Minister's position and for the Labour strategy?
In the short run, Starmer is safe. I think he's probably safe in the short run anyway, but he's definitely safe between now and May. And then it will depend on how bad the May elections are. And if he's won Gorton Denton, then if the results in May are bad but not awful, then that combined with a victory in Gorton might see him through to the summer.
Yeah.
Whereas if the May results are absolutely catastrophic, even if they win Gorton, because it's going to be clear that even if Labour wins Gorton, its vote will be very sharply down. And by the way, be a point ahead for the minute. The Labour got 50% of the last election. If they win on, say, 30%, then a 20-point drop is by no means uncommon for a governing party in a by-election. But the problem is this, that Labour did very badly Gorton and Denton last time because the Workers' Party put up a candidate who got 10%.
And you got a large Muslim vote.
They would normally have been Labour. Labour in 2019 had got, I think, 67%. So as a historic underlying Labour vote is north of 60%. So if Labour gets 30%, then that's a very big drop against Labour's historic base. That's right.
Because Gorton and Denton is actually one of, and its predecessor incarnations, was it Gorton and Redditch or some, I can't remember the exact previous name of it, but Andrew Gwynn, first elected to that.
Denton and Redditch, I think.
Denton and Redditch back in 2005. It was, one of a smaller number of Labour seats where most people voted for them, where more than 50% of the people voted for them. Whereas, and I think now we are just seeing that much more frequently across the whole country, that people are winning with far less than half the vote.
There's also another pattern that's emerged in the polling that's available out of Gorton and Denton, and that's the fact that the Greens seem to have much stickier voters in terms of when they're asked, who would you vote for tactically if it was going to keep Farage out? They go, well, no, we're sticking with the Greens. Whereas Labour, as you've highlighted, already coming from a series of electoral setbacks, doesn't have that stickiness. And have you seen anything that suggests that that lack of stickiness amongst their own voters is something that they should be concerned about on a national scale as well?
Yes. The votes that Labour has lost since the 2024 election have been much more to the left than to the right. They've lost, a fair number to Reform. That deserves as a consideration and action. But they've lost far more to the Lib Dems and the Greens. And you're right that the voters gone to Lib Dem, on the whole, to a large majority, if they at the next election are in a Labour-Tory battle, they will vote Labour. Greens, some will, but a lot won't. Greens are a sort of mirage of Reform, in that they've both got a core vote of people absolutely passionate on Green/Reform issues and have no time for Labour/Conservative. And then they've got others who are dissatisfied with Conservative/Labour, at the moment between elections, park their votes in a tactical situation, will probably go back to the party they originally came from, Conservative or Labour. It is very, very clear of the really core Green vote, I don't know, 5, 6, 7%, they will do nothing but Green. And they don't think there's enough to choose between Labour and Conservative, for example, to abandon the Greens. They think that the mainstream parties are not that different when it comes to the issues they care about, climate change and so on. And they will stick with the Greens. So the Green vote, yes, is quite a lot stickier than the Lib Dem vote.
But Peter, if they do win on a reduced majority, do you think that will be read as a vindication rather than a warning? Their strategy is working.
It'll be asserted as a turning point, a vindication of what they're doing. That is one of the reasons why Starmer will probably get some leeway between now and the May elections. One of the things, people compare what happened 18 months ago with 97, very similar Labour majorities. Here's the difference. Practically Labour, every seat that Labour gained in 97, they held in 2001. So the new MPs were enthusiastic. Now, a number of the new MPs this time are friends of mine from 5, 10, 20 years ago. And all the ones I spoke to in the sort of autumn of 2024 were still full of excitement and positivity and eagerness. They're now all scared because there are people who won seats which would not normally be Labour seats. And they're desperately scared. They're frightened. So if the conclusion they draw from the by-election, even if Labour wins it narrowly, is, well, on this kind of vote or anything like it, I have no chance of holding my own seat.
Then it won't. They won't.
And that's why I think after May, if the May elections go badly for Labour, the issue will revive.
Quiet Riot. Quiet Riot.
Now let's do 2 scenarios in one. For me personally, the worst scenario, Reform win. But give me the difference between Reform winning and Labour coming second and Reform winning and Labour coming third. And how much of a difference does that make to the arithmetic that backbenchers and others will be doing?
I'm not sure it'll make much difference unless the gap between Labour and Green is massive, and I don't think it will be. And I think they'll be relatively close. Although there's a big left-of-centre majority in Gorton Denton, the lack of tactical voting, the lack of a clear signal as to who was the viable party in this particular contest on this particular day, and therefore I think the consequence of a Reform victory in a seat where no more than a third of the electorate is on the right, that will provoke a lot of discussion and head-scratching around the issue of how do we make sure that tactical voting does take place in the next election. Now, of course, the Labour Party's rule book says, you can't ever say vote for another party. But there are lots of things you can do. And frankly, were done quietly before the last general election. I mean, Labour simply didn't bother
in Lib Dem,
with the 18
Tory seats.
Tory seats that the Lib Dems were after, and the Lib Dems pulled their resources out. So it worked quite effectively.
Greens are not going to do that because their second places are all in Labour-facing seats.
That's
so
right.
these progressive tragedy seats could become a bigger feature of our elections going forward.
So I think the precise order, if Reform wins, as it were cosmetically worse for Labour to be third than second, I don't think it'll be analytically much different because I think it'll only be a point or two in it, I would guess, between the second and third place.
Mm-hmm. And, it is a wake-up call that tactical voting is an extremely blunt instrument that should not have to be used. Far better to have a progressive alliance and far better still to have PR. All right, final then. The Greens win with Labour in second, or the Greens win with Labour in third. I mean, this surely will be a real wake-up call to Labour that they are not the main challenger to reform in every seat in the country that they claim that they are.
Yeah, no, that becomes, really interesting because Labour have lost the dominance on the left. They've lost one of Labour's safest seats. And if it becomes clear that the difference between a Reform victory and a Green victory was the number of Labour supporters who went Green to keep Reform out, then again, if you're a Labour apparatchik, you would rather Labour got a couple more thousand more votes and the Greens a couple of thousand fewer, even if this meant a Reform victory. If you're anybody but a Labour apparatchik on the centre-left, be bloody pleased that enough Labour votes switched to the Greens to keep Reform out. Yeah. And so, within the Labour world, I think you're going to find the playing out of the tension between those two positions.
You're a veteran watcher of by-elections and all things electoral. Did you read anything personally into Starmer turning up?
It was odd because, as I understand it, he sort of turned up but didn't tell anybody and spent a bit of time with the candidate and some party workers. I didn't see pictures of him glad-handing voters in the street. I mean, did I miss that? Was he? But if it was a quiet insertion, that suggests to me that he wanted to avoid the criticism that he was frit, that he was scared to go. Yeah. But equally, the advice would have been, for God's sake, don't show your face in the town centre because people hate us, and that won't help.
Yeah.
So it was weird. But I'm speculating for the reasons for him going and for the reason for him going in the way he did. I don't really know, but I think in the end he probably did have to go, and it was probably wise for him to go with very few people noticing.
It's not the kind of seat that anyone would describe as affluent. Therefore, it is a totemic seat that would be extremely compounded by the cost of living crisis, which the Prime Minister has made his big campaign of the year so far. I'm going to bring down the cost of living. I'm going to ease the pain. Good news earlier this week about the energy price cap, good news about inflation, but it's falling tone deaf with the kinds of voters in Denton, certainly, and probably in parts of Gorton too, who are still paying an extraordinarily higher amount for their home heating at the petrol pump, at the supermarket. And so it sort of feels hollow. And I do wonder if actually that campaign might have backfired on him a little bit. It's extremely difficult to tell people that the rate of inflation slowing is helping them, because of course that does still mean prices are rising. They're just not rising as quickly. And with wages having not kept pace at all, and unemployment figures being pretty worrying, and particularly for young people, lots of whom will be in the Gorton part of the seat, I'm just not sure that was the right messaging for them to go on. But
I think that's right. And the politics of inflation is rather curious. I mean, firstly, people know what they got at the end of the month, and the statistics that inflation is 3.1 or 3.4% mean nothing to them. Yeah.
Except that they know their pay packet didn't go up 3% every month.
In America, one of the questions around Trump's second victory, in the year leading up to the presidential election, inflation came down and wage rates went up, but but the prices were still higher than they had been. What should have been good news was real wages did go up quite sharply. But and the analysis I've seen from America, the explanation is that people thought their wage increase was a result of their efforts. But the higher price of eggs and petrol and other things took a lot of that deserved increase away from them. So they didn't feel, oh, goody, I'm better off. It would have been far better if salaries had remained constant and prices had fallen a couple of percent. It would have the same effect, a 2% increase in real pay. But that would have been far more attractive to workers than to have continuing inflation. So I don't want to talk about you, Kenny or Naomi, put you in this category, but a lot of people who follow politics closely, I think, overstate the importance of as Tony Benn used to say, issues. Whether it's unemployment or inflation or Europe or even immigration. The people whose votes swing about, the ones who are not strongly committed to one party or another, the things that usually determine the way they end up are what's called valence property. Do I trust this person? Are they strong? Are they on my side? Are they competent? I think the problem for Keir Starmer personally and the Labour government generally
is we were told he'd be bloody competent, if nothing else. If he couldn't be charismatic and if he couldn't be a wonderful communicator and all this, he would at least be a decent technocrat.
And the evidence is the public don't trust him. Yeah. So if Keir Starmer says something which sounds right about inflation, people say, oh, well, he's just saying it. And one of the problems is that when voters turn against a political leader, it's very hard to call them back. John Major was destroyed by Black Wednesday. 6 months after the 1992 election, pound falls out of the exchange rate mechanism. Now, anybody who lived through that period, what happened in the 4.5 years during Black Wednesday, the 1997 election, economy grew faster, unemployment came down, interest rates came down, inflation came down. The economy stormed away.
We had the
People were
traffic
better
cone
off.
hotline.
Yeah, but the point is, people had made up their minds about John Major. Yeah. So all the great economic news didn't help him.
They saw him eating peas in his pants on Spitting Image, and that was it.
That's right.
I agree with you. And it's similar in 2014, actually. Clegg obviously has that disastrous set of European elections, having gone head-to-head with Farage, and is umming and ahhing about whether or not to go ahead of the general. And Paddy Ashdown said to him, allegedly, don't worry, I probably can't make the voters trust you again after 5 years of coalition, but I can make them like you again. We can rehabilitate your image. Yeah. And at that moment, I was like, then we're done for, because there is absolutely no way voters are going to back a leader they do not trust. Yeah. They don't even have to really like you. They do have to believe in you and trust that you will deliver.
That's right. And so I think my doubt about the Starmer strategy is, even if they achieve the economic advances between now and 29, I'm not sure politically he'll do them as much good as they think he will.
So that's political gravity taken care of then. Have we got a call to action on this topic?
One call to action: go and sign up to Peter's Substack. I have been following it for at least a year now. I think you've been going with it. It's brilliant. We'll leave a link in the show notes. I think a lot of you probably signed up after Peter came on the last time, but we've been growing. We've got new listeners who may not have heard you on our show before, Peter. So, keep the great content coming, and our listeners will hoover it up.
And look out for one early on Friday morning.
Indeed.
Like early response to the by-election results.
Quiet Riot.
Hey, it's Sterling K. Brown from the Hulu original series Paradise. The next chapter begins as Xavier's search for his wife takes him above ground, and what he finds will change everything. It was never just about the bunker. Tune in and discover the truth lies outside. Paradise, the official podcast, is now streaming, and stream Paradise on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
Quiet Riot.
Okay, it's time for our weekly public service announcement, when we scan the horizon for the latest existential threat to Western civilization. Is it a rebranded biscuit? Is it a statue that looks slightly apologetic? Is it a children's book featuring a hedgehog with boundaries who can say, somewhere, someone is angrily typing? Yeah, it's time for Wokie Dokie.
Wokie Dokie.
Alex wanted to keep his hand in this week, so he has recorded this special one all for you.
Hello, my lovelies. This is Alex speaking to you from the beyond. Well, not quite. The beyond help, more like. I wanted to do a Wokie Dokie, both because I miss you loads, and because this is a seasonal one, and I didn't want to miss it. So Bedford Borough Council wished everyone a happy Lent, the period of 40 days when many Christians may choose to give up certain luxuries and make space to reflect, pray and read the Bible to prepare for the celebrations of Easter. They put that out in a Facebook post. Maggie Tyers replied underneath, "Funny you put Ramadan up first. It's a Christian country first and foremost." To which Bedford Borough Council replied, "Maggie, Ramadan began on February 17th. That is why we put our Ramadan message on social media yesterday. Lent began today, which is why our Lent message went on social media one day later. The date of Lent is determined by the church calendar rooted in the decisions of the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The official start of Ramadan traditionally depends on the sighting of the new crescent moon. Bedford Council does not hold any authority over the Council of Nicaea and was not responsible for the creation of the moon 4.5 billion years ago. So there you have it. This week, the First Council of Nicaea is woke, and perhaps the moon. So if you're casting around for things to give up for Lent, Maggie, how about you abstain from being a twat for the next 40 days? Love you lots. Speak on Sunday.
Thank you, Alex. We miss you, and we'll see you again at the weekend, listeners. We love it when you send us the instances of woke you find. So send your woke treasure to quietriotpod@gmail.com.
Quiet Riot.
Now, let's cast a wider net. If you're listening to this on Thursday, we are exactly 10 weeks from the May the 7th elections. Scotland and Wales will be choosing their representatives for Holyrood and the Senedd, respectively. And in England, 5,000 seats across 136 local councils will be voted on, which is, of course, 30 more than was anticipated after the government reversed the permission it had granted to the 30 councils in question to delay electing representatives while they reorganised into unitary authorities. Now, politics professor Rob Ford thinks that is a worst-case scenario for incumbents.
When you look at the areas that were cancelled and have now been uncancelled, it includes lots of rural and semi-rural chunks of eastern England, places like Suffolk and Norfolk, where we would expect Reform to do very well. They were the largest party by seats in last year's local elections. As things stand in the polls, with a very fragmented context, they're the Snow White, with all the other parties being the Seven Dwarfs. And because it's a first-past-the-post electoral system, if you're the biggest, you get the most seats. They stand to do very, very well out of this decision. And also from Labour's perspective, a lot of these councils were Labour controlled in some way or another. It's kind of a worst case scenario to have an election cancelled and then uncancelled at very short notice. You've got no time to prepare, no time to campaign, no time to organise. All of the advantages of incumbency get eroded in this scenario.
It's the biggest electoral event since the general election of 2024, and obvious caveats about this round of voting being influenced by issues specific to each of those areas and nations aside, it will provide a pretty chunky set of data for psephologists to dig into in order to test assumptions they are so far extrapolating purely from opinion polling. Okay, Peter and Naomi, let's start from where we left off. Do you both think the voters might be looking at by-elections like the one this week for signals on whom to back tactically in May?
I think we had Caerphilly last year, by-election, which kind of showed that there was an alternative to Labour if you wanted to, fight off Reform. And of course, with the Gorton and Denton by-election, we've seen the Greens making a very strong case that you don't have to always hold your nose and vote Labour to stop reform, you can come to us. So I do think people who care about tactical voting will be looking at it. Most people don't. Most people don't even register the fact that there is an election happening in their area until the week of, maybe even the day of, maybe not at all. So the extent to which I think these things influence tactical voting, I'm going to say it's very difficult to call. The YouGov analysis on tactical voting last week that you and I talked about at the weekend, Kenny, showing that Labour voters tending to be much more up for doing it than Green and Lib Dem voters who are up for doing it, but not in quite such numbers. And as we talked about in the first half of the show, and Peter mentioned, you now have a hardening of some of those newly excited Green voters that this is their chance, and no, they're not going to constantly be told you've got to, hold your nose and vote for another party to stop the one you really hate winning. I don't know, but there will be tactical voting on the other side as well. I mean, I think what was fascinating about the first half of our show today, Peter, is we didn't talk about the Tories. I mean, isn't it incredible that we are now not talking about the party
it didn't feel that we missed anything out,
was in government for most of the 20th century and for a really big chunk of the 21st. But there will be tactical voting happening on the right block of British politics as well.
The first point to make is that I think tactical voting is easy. I'm not always sure that tactical is the right word, because that implies, and it's true for some people, that they have a clear idea of who their first choice is, but they have a clear view that there's somebody they really want to beat, and therefore they go from first to second choice. I think a better word is negative election. Yeah. It's that they're more concerned to beat somebody they hate than to support somebody they like. Now, at a general election, adherence to where social media has really come into its own, there are a number of sites that say this constituency vote for this. Now, the problem is, of course, if the sites start disagreeing, and they did at the beginning of the 2024 election, by the end, I think the tactical voting sites were more or less in agreement. But in local elections, you don't have that. So, for example, I live in a London borough, a Labour London borough, most of them are, a Labour London borough, but a Lib Dem stronghold within that borough. But I wonder how many of my neighbours know that it is a Lib Dem stronghold, and that if your aim is to keep the Conservatives out or Reform out, this is a place where you vote Lib Dem, not Labour. Some will know it, others won't. On the other hand, I think there will be a lot of negative voting. Let me try this out on you. That elections, as a general rule, are either prosperity elections or punishment elections. And I think what we've got this May are punishment elections in London, in Scotland, in Wales, in much of England. Who they're punishing will vary a bit, although they're punishing Labour to some extent in all of them.
Yeah.
But to what extent will the SNP, who certainly suffered a punishment beating in the general election? If we frame what's happening in May as a whole series of punishment elections, who in each case are they trying to punish, and what information do they have to make sure they know how to punish where they live with their vote?
I mean, it's a fascinating conundrum, because first past the post does many things, but one of the things that I really dislike about it is it simplifies electoral preference to the point of stupidity at some points. I mean, in my constituency, the Highlands, I've got a Liberal Democrat Westminster MP, an SNP, MSP on the constituency level. On the regional level, we've got Conservative, Labour. There's every colour of politics kind of represented there. And that gives you so many outs when it comes to delivering punishment in particular. If you're supporting someone, you know who you're supporting. That's not difficult.
Yes.
You're absolutely right, though. But the options that we have in terms of dishing out punishments in different ways it's just far more flexible.
And of course, in May, it is about who governs in Scotland and Wales. Yeah. Whereas at a by-election, you're not changing who's in number 10. So you can issue a punishment beating, send a warning shot in the comfort and relative safety of knowing you're not about to put Farage into number 10 or whatever other way you want to do it.
But Naomi, I agree to a point, but remember the 2024 general election, that was a punishment election. And part of Labour's problem was they failed, I think, properly to understand that very few people were voting for Labour.
You had one of the lowest turnouts on record
Yep.
in a general election, and Labour barely getting a third of the popular vote.
Yeah, and Keir Starmer's rating as a party leader wasn't that great. It's worse now than it was, but it wasn't that great. The fact that 60% of the people in Gorton and Denton, roughly, are going to vote for insurgent parties, not for mainstream parties, that is a punishment. That is evidence of punishment.
Yeah, but I completely agree with my only point being that in the Senedd elections and in the Holyrood elections, you are choosing who governs. You know, it's not quite the same as a midterm kick. These are national.
The result is there's a government.
Yeah.
But I wonder, and I'm presumably Plaid Cymru will be the dominant party in some form of coalition.
Yeah.
And I wonder what their reputation will be 18 months from now.
That takes us quite nicely on to the Welsh election, because in some ways the Senedd election is the most interesting of the elections, both in political terms, but in practice, because it's changing from a first-past-the-post system to proportional representation.
We've been talking for a long time about the fact that you don't have a Welsh leader and that they wanted to leave it till quite close to the election. And obviously we're now getting close to the election, and they have announced a man who, I'm going to be honest, I hadn't heard of, and his name is Dan Thomas. So, had you heard of Dan Thomas, guys?
I know a comedian called Dan Thomas who when the news, I got a breaking news alert and I texted him saying congratulations, and he said, what? And then I linked an article and he went, oh no.
I know, he messaged me going, this is terrible for me, and I was like, it is.
To be fair, I can understand you guys not knowing who he is, because he's for several decades has been a councillor in Barnet, and that's Barnet in London.
Does that, for somebody like you, a professional in this field, provide an opportunity to mine rich data from the last few elections and to see kind of exactly how PR works in direct comparison to first past the post?
It adds to the evidence. The Electoral Reform Society, ever since the Star over Bethlehem, wanted the single transferable vote. Well, if you want to see what actually happens, just look at Ireland. You can like or dislike, but there are certain characteristics. For example, the extreme parochialism of it as candidates from one party, try to do better than other candidates from the same party to get higher up the list on votes. The cure for anybody who likes the single transferable vote is to watch an election in Ireland. Because it is not, what they say is it gives people opportunities to choose whether they want a more left-wing or a more right-wing Labour, more centrist or extreme. No, that's not how it works. That's not what happens. The other point, I think Wales, I think is relatively straightforward. There will be a progressive majority. Plaid will be the biggest party, whether it's with Labour and the Lib Dems and the Greens, or 2 out of 3 or 1 out of 3, I don't know. But there'll be a Plaid Cymru-led administration. Scotland, it may end up. It just depends on the numbers. There may be a unionist majority of MSPs, but you only have a viable unionist administration if the Conservatives are part of it. What happens in Scotland, to a less extent Wales, and in some, perhaps London boroughs, what happens after the May elections? Are we going to get, what will be the administration in Scotland? It might be quite difficult to get it. Will there be a lot of Green/Lib Dem boroughs in London? How will that work? What if Reform in parts of London or outside London are the biggest party, but other parties don't want to work with them, but not all want to work with each other? There's going to be a lot of playing out of the politics of not just the votes, but the politics of multi-party life, which will, I think, cause some surprises and maybe some concern.
I've got 2 points based on quite a lot of information you gave us there, Peter. Thank you. First, I think the really interesting thing to do is going to be to unwind the first past, the PR result in the Senedd to see what would have happened under first past the post. That, to me, is going to be the most interesting thing. Would Reform have done disproportionately very well in Wales under first past the post, and has their grip of, on executive power been weakened by PR or not? So I think that's going to be really interesting, because I think people will probably want to fearmonger about PR and go, oh, look, Reform have got all these AMs now because of PR. No, they would have had even more under first past the post or not. Let's see how the maths works out. And I think, you're dead right in terms of who's going to be able to work with whom. We've had instances of Labour councillors being reprimanded by the NEC, being kicked out of the party for trying to go into coalition with Lib Dems and Greens and part of the country. I don't know that they'll be able to, wield that kind of iron fist over their party without accepting that Reform would then be the ones to go and try and form a minority administration.
Can I just say to one thing? Wales, it was first past the post plus.
That's right.
What you had was 40 first past the post
Yeah.
and then 20 top up. I'm not entirely sure if you operated the old system this year, that the ratio of the proportion of seats would be that different from what we'll actually get. Because the old system had this distorting effect because Labour, even with well under half the vote, would win at least 30 of the 40 seats and therefore had a majority of the 60. That's gone. The paradox could well be that under the old system, Plaid would have had a majority and they won't under the new system because they might have been the beneficiaries of the first past the post segment of the Welsh election.
There's a point I think that's quite important for our listeners in particular to make as well, is that when we talk about the difference between first past the post and the various forms of PR, I think it's quite important not to fall into the trap of saying, look, Reform would have got more or less under a particular setup. Because if your view is that a proportional representative system is a better system, you've got to take the pain if it goes against you.
No, it's a better system because it doesn't give 100% executive power to anyone, especially those that can't command the popular vote. So I'm not undermining your point at all. I don't think any parties should have the total executive power that first past the post gives them. I don't think it makes for healthy democracy, and is why the majority of democracies don't have it. Kenny, you're a Scot. We've been talking about Scotland without involving you, which feels wrong. How is it all shaping as a contest up there? What is the recent poll showing us? What is your gut as a Highlander?
As a Highlander? Well, the most recent polling is a couple of weeks out of date. There's two lots of polls that have come out in the last 3-4 weeks. YouGov have done some polling and Better Together have done some polling. And while the figures differ a little bit, the general patterns are quite clear at this stage. The SNP remain, both in constituency vote terms and regional list vote terms, ahead of the field quite comfortably, looking like they're polling above 30%, however you measure, and looking like they're quite comfortably take a third of the vote at least. So from their perspective, and given the last few years that they've had, I would imagine they would look at this going, all right, we'll take that right now. Yeah, thanks very much. Reform, I find this still very difficult to get my head around. If I look at it through a sort of a time window over the last 6 months, you think, well, Reform are doing quite well. They're polling at over a fifth of the vote. If I look at it over the time frame of the last 2 years or the last 4 years, it's utterly unbelievable. I mean, they've come from nowhere in England, but in Scotland, which is a much more left-leaning country, they're now regularly polling.
And is that because they're taking Tory? Is that almost entirely collapse in Scottish Tory vote?
They're taking votes from everywhere. I mean, we've looked at it. There are people who have been on a political journey in Scotland from the SNP to Labour as a kicking vote, that you might describe it, Peter, and then moved from Labour on to Reform as well. I mean, there are clear patterns. But overall...
Wait, so is the SNP a gateway drug to Reform? That's what I've heard. They're like the weed. And then Labour are like the E, and Reform are like the crack.
Crack cocaine.
Yeah.
Well, the crack pots perhaps, but maybe not crack cocaine. So, I mean, the pattern up there is quite clear that, the SNP are in the pound seats at the moment, but Reform are not to be taken lightly. And there's a real battle between Reform and Labour. The Greens' position in Scotland is slightly different, apart from the fact they're quite a different party to the Greens in England and Wales. They're more left of centre than the party south of the border. But also, they've tasted power already. They supported the SNP as a junior partner for a little while. So from a voter's perspective, the Greens, if you like, are already tainted if you don't like what you saw when they were in power. So there are levels of nuance up there which are not to be ignored.
under the Scottish voting system, you have a constituency vote and then the top-up vote. And the Greens, I'm not sure they even put up a candidate for the constituency section. They go for the top-up list. If your aim as a voter is to have the maximum number of pro-independence MSPs, you give your constituency vote to the SNP, but you don't give it to the SNP. You don't give the SNP your regional list vote. You give it to the Greens.
That's right.
And if every SNP voter voted for the SNP locally, but for the Greens for the top-up, then you would have a massive SNP Green Holyrood, even if only a third or just over a third of the Scottish electorate are one or the other. I mean, there is a fundamental flaw which the role of the Greens in Scottish politics. Because why, if you're an SNP supporter, why on earth would you vote SNP for the regional list vote? It's irrational.
It shines a spotlight on just how deep into politics most voters go. You know, it's not a difficult jump to make, that one. And at the point where the SNP and the Greens both have substantial enough numbers, they've got a mandate to go back to the, to go to Westminster and say it's time to discuss separation again. And given that that's the most important issue for the SNP, regardless of what is at the top of their to-do lists, you would think that they would work harder to do this. But it remains, if one was a unionist, that remains a real threat, a genuine threat. And I think the thing that's saving him is the fact that the Greens are a particularly, a fairly strong brand of left-wing politics in Scotland. They're not populist in the way that Zach Polanski's populist south of the border. And it's a different mix.
Quiet, Riot.
You know you need fiber for a healthy gut, but do you actually know how to get it? Quaker's been serving up fiber since 1877, with over 100 great-tasting, good source of fiber options to choose from. Whether you like old-fashioned oats, instant oatmeal, granola, or oatmeal squares, Quaker makes it delicious. So good. Get your fiber with Quaker. Shop Quaker's good source of fiber products at a store near you.
Quiet, Riot.
Given that the Greens are an affiliated but a separate party in Scotland, but they're the same party for England and Wales, why is the Polanski tide not particularly lifting either of those boats?
Well, I mean, you answered the Scottish one. You know, he is not leader of the Green Party in Scotland, so park that there. I think in Wales, it's because you've got a left-wing bloc that is already well represented. You know, Welsh Labour, and actually Scottish Labour, I have always found to sit somewhere to the left of Westminster Labour, less tainted by Blairism and sort of Blairite right-wing Labour ideology, definitely perceived to have been more on the left of the party, or soft left of the party, certainly. And so are Plaid Cymru. You know, they are also a left-leaning, liberal, civic nationalist branded party, more so than the SNP, I would say, sort of economically probably a bit more left-wing. So you've already got a very well-represented group of parties of the kind of voter that might appeal to the Greens. That said, they probably are going to get their first Senedd seat, largely because of the change in the voting system. That's good. And I think the latest More in Common poll probably had them, I would say, on the low side. I would expect them to, on the day, do a little bit better than the figure that Luke Trill had them on, I think about a week or so ago, where I think they had them on 5%. I can see them actually outperforming the Lib Dems and doing a bit better there.
The tide is a really, really good analogy, actually, because the tides only lift boats to the same height in the same area. That's how they work. High tides happen at different times in different places because of local topography. And Scotland and Wales have a very different political topography. Scotland has got PR Holyrood's dominant centre-left Nationalist Party, Greens who've already tasted power. Or, to put it another way, Scotland and Wales are different lands. You know, it's as simple as that in many ways.
Celtic nationalism isn't identical.
Absolutely.
Peter, we know that a good or bad campaign can make a huge difference at a general election. Look at Theresa May in 2017. Are local and devolved parliament elections in some ways more stable? And what I mean is, have most voters made up their mind ahead of them in a way that they might waver a bit more before a general election?
I don't know if this has been tested exhaustively. Here's my guess as to what would happen if it was polled, surveyed exhaustively, is that people who are going to vote, most of them know, the great majority know who they're going to vote for. The question is, do they vote at all? You know, in the, let's talk about the English local elections in May. It will be, broadly speaking, a national election. And now what you get is, in some places, you get something different happening. I do remember when the poll text came in.
Yes.
Wandsworth bucked a trend, a pro-Labour trend in 1990, because Wandsworth said, we will not raise any money. You know, we will not, the poll tax will be zero. So you can get local factors.
You can.
Coming in. But broadly speaking, you know, you get a broad national picture. And the main thing that will be concerning people the day after the May elections is, what is that national picture?
The story nationally, things you've mentioned, it seems to show that that reform, for now anyway, appear to have peaked. You know, there's a pattern there. The councils they already run, it's not stretching a point too far to say there's an element of bin fire about quite a few of them. And their big daddy in the US has got his own struggles, hasn't he?
And their other, I don't know, uncle, Elon, he's out batting for Rupert Lowe.
Yeah, there's never an opportunity to shoot himself in the foot with moderate voters that he never grabs. Why do we think that they're still being predicted to do so well in this set of votes? It's a tricky one, I know.
There are some signs, they're not conclusive, that reform are slightly less popular than they were in October, November. And this is where the by-election this week, I think we've been talking about, you know, who wins and all that. But remember, Reform won the Runcorn by-election last year with 39% of the votes. Well, if Reform don't win, they're down at sort of 28%. People are going to say, hang on, that's not nearly as well, the same part of the country, not nearly as well as they did last year. And if in the May election, last May, the projected national share for Reform was, I think, 30% or thereabouts. If again it's down to sort of 26, 27, then one of the questions is going to be, has Reform peaked? Is it on its way out? Certainly until this past autumn, the only Reform story in town was that it was gaining votes and where it was gaining votes from and the consequences of the threats and populism and so on. Well, maybe that narrative is going to start shifting, and it might start shifting at the end of this week.
It's astonishing that the lessons in sort of expectation management that we continue to take from politics, isn't it? The idea that we could look at Reform taking more than a quarter of the votes and say, that's a bit of a disaster for them, really. Just shows you that you can take nothing for granted. Do you think it points to a change in the political cycle, though? I mean, I'm old enough to remember the rise and fall of the SDP, and that was a fairly short-lived project.
But Reform's lead has been sustained for far longer than the SDP Alliance lead ever was.
I mean, that's a key, but it's still, in the grand scheme of things, it's a new kid at the table, isn't it?
But remember that, and this is where First Past the Post has its sort of tentacles into it, if Reform get 30% the next election, they're almost certainly the largest party. Depends on how the other votes split. If they're at 25%, they're probably not the largest party. And if they're down to 21, 22%, they may not even be the main opposition. The gradient of the transfer of votes to seats is very steep in the mid-20s for Reform. The Lib Dems, 18 months ago, 72 seats with 13% of the vote. In 1983, the Liberal Democrat SDP Alliance got twice the vote, 26%, and had, I think, 23 MPs. And the difference was that in 1983, they did a lot of votes everywhere, but very few places enough to win. If you look at the Lib Dem votes this time, they did incredibly well in 80 seats, most of which they won, and did hardly anything anywhere else. And Reform, and that was why Reform, with more votes than the Lib Dems, got far fewer seats. If Reform hang around, within probably 2 or 3 elections, the clumping will happen.
Right.
But it won't happen, I think, in time for the next election.
So final question then, Peter. Polling. You've developed your instinct. You've talked about, quite rightly, I think, the issues aren't the motivating factor. It's much more to do with your vibe of whether you like a politician or not, a leader or not. Do you believe them? Do you trust them? So what do you think opinion polling could be getting wrong, or that it could begin to do differently, so that we don't end up missing things like we used to do with the shy Tory, or, tactical voting being overestimated, underestimated, whatever. Like, how does the industry adapt to much of what you've kind of told us today, or can it?
I wish there was a straightforward answer. If we knew the answer, the pollsters would make the changes. Here's the fundamental problem. 50 or 60 years ago, polls were done face-to-face. Yeah. And on the whole, people were willing to talk to pollsters. You got very good response rates. Today, some of it's by phone. The great majority of polling is done online, and they're people who are picked up in various consumer panels and so on. Yeah. Some self-selection. The people who are approached in a particular poll, the pollster chooses them, but they choose them from a panel. Yeah. Right? Therefore, all polling these days, you're trying to extrapolate from the minority you can reach to the majority who won't talk to you. Mm. And for example, probably one of the reasons why Trump was underestimated in each of his 3 contests was because some of the MAGA voters thought pollsters were part of the corrupt establishment and wouldn't talk to them.
Oh, they are.
Yeah. So there's a lot of room for things to go wrong, however meticulously you try and do it.
What about AI? Is AI going to disrupt polling? I mean, I've heard that the Republicans are doing things like training the model to come up with archetype of voter, so that they can just ping questions at the AI persona rather than have to go to real people. I mean, do you see any of that?
I'm not sure. I mean, Dominic Cummings, whatever you think about him, used not AI, but used sort of computer technology and databases very skillfully in the Brexit referendum. I'm sure we're not far off being able to use AI to give a broad sense of the national moods on any given topic. But trying to measure an election, I'm not sure an AI approach, scanning what people do and think and say, that can't you get. I don't see how you get that to within 1 or 2 or even 3%.
If you do manage to get it to within 1%, you can just do away with elections altogether. We've plugged it into the machine, and that's your prime minister for the next 5 years. Bye.
Yeah, but I really don't know. Already, polls are being done differently from 10 years ago when I was doing them. But we're chasing a target that keeps moving.
Yeah.
I'm far more impressed by how close the polls get than I'm appalled by the fact that sometimes they get it wrong.
One little last sub-question on that is the reason they get closer than you might expect because of all the fiddling and fettling that goes on after the data has been worked on. In other words, if there are outlying figures, somebody quietly goes, we need to introduce a new variable and bring this back in.
Right. What you're really talking about, Kenny, is the final poll that each pollster does before election. It brings out on the eve of the election. And they know they're going to be judged by this. So they do whatever they can to get it right. Now, if you're saying to me, do pollsters ever look at the figures and done all their weighting as they normally do, and they think, that doesn't feel quite right. Do they tweak the numbers? Yes, they do, because there'll always be a legitimate tweak you can make, even if the motive for the tweak is to
terms and conditions apply.
And I'm not going to shame companies and people I've worked with. They are genuinely trying to get it right, and so the question is it morally appropriate if you genuinely think the figures you've got before you are not quite right? Do you say, well, that's what we published? Economics is the same, by the way.
Yeah.
All the economic modelers, in truth, the computer spews out and they say, that's not right. They say something in it isn't right.
The only difference is the economists try to disagree with each other, whereas the pollsters have a habit of trying to converge because none wants to be the outlier. Right, we must move on to the call to action.
Okay.
Kenny, what should people do?
Look, it's a really easy one, and it probably doesn't apply to lots of you listening, but it probably does apply to people that you know. Just triple check that you're registered to vote, because it's important, this stuff. Check everyone in your household is eligible to vote, and do have a plan for polling day if you're not a postal voter. Or indeed, if you don't like the rain and it's going to be wet, just make sure you register your vote.
Quiet Riot.
And now it's time to lighten your load by spotlighting a story that proves not everything is going in the wrong direction. It's time for Grin and Share It.
Good news is welcome to me. Bad news is hell come to me. Good news. I want good news.
What have you got for us, Naomi?
Justice has been in the news this week. Early prisoner release, trial without jury, other attempts to speed up justice and reduce pressure on jails making headlines. And I found a lovely story about restorative justice in Fort McMurray, Alberta, Canada. Now, it began in 2024. Two brothers had a big falling out, and one drew a knife on the other one. And their mum called the cops, and the knife brother was arrested. But instead of facing the usual trial, conviction, and potential criminal record, he was offered the alternative, restorative justice. And it's often harder and more brutal than a court hearing for the defendant. You know, criminals are forced to confront the reality of their action on their victim, the victim's family. And it can be really, really harrowing. But it tends to be much more effective than traditional prison crime. And it has been in Fort McMurray. They expanded the program to include adults, not just children. And of the 115 people who have completed it, only one has reoffended.
One?
One, yeah.
Wow. I mean, this presumably actually involved the mother and the brother as well. That's as part of the process. Yeah. You don't want to fall out with your mum.
No.
But 1 out of 115.
Yeah, I mean, look, we know that it is, a pretty effective form, and probably something that we need to do a bit more of.
Well, we'll drop a link on that into the show notes so listeners can find out a little bit more about that. That's an amazing figure. Thank you, Naomi. And as ever, listeners, don't forget to share your little good news stories with us so that we too can grin and share it.
And that is a wrap on this week's show. Our enormous thanks to Peter Kellner for joining us once more.
A pleasure, Naomi. I really enjoyed it.
Listeners, don't forget to sign up to Peter's Substack. As ever, you'll find a link down below.
It's a fab Substack, do that. And similarly, don't forget to back Quiet Riot for a $5 a month if you can to help keep this little old show on the road. Head over to ko-fi.com, Quiet Riot Pod, to sign up. And once you've signed up, you'll be on our invite list to future live sessions, the next one being an Ask Us Anything Zoom call. We're going to be back at the weekend in our Sunday School edition, and until then, farewell and keep on rioting. Just do it quietly.
And make sure you listen to Behind the Lines and Podacy, who are all part of our family, both of which have a bumper new episode out this week. We love you very, very much. Bye.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith and Alex Andreou. Produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta. Artwork by Simone Canelu. And edited by me, Alex Reese.
Quiet Riot.